to the Thrive Wearables track at this year's Giant Health Show. Delighted to have you here for this session today. This is one of 5 sessions that we're running at this year's show, and we're really happy to be back yet again running these sessions at Giant. We've been here for the last couple of years, and of course it's slightly different this year, but we're all mucking in and working with this new system, and we're delighted to have brought together a fantastic panel for this session. So just a bit about Thrive. We are a design and development consultancy based in the UK, and we have a mission to create wearable products and product services that have significant health and wellness impact. We really judge ourselves on that impact rating, and we work very closely with a range of stakeholders across startup companies all the way through to corporate organizations to create those wearable products. You can find out about us and about the speakers at this session today at thrivewearables.com/giant2020. And I'm sure you'll be able to find out all sorts of other interesting stuff about the speakers today by looking on LinkedIn and connecting. There will be live sessions after this first part of the day, and we will be hosting those through the digital systems that are available at Giant. And I'm going to introduce now Steve Parr, the MedTech growth consultant that is running this session. Delighted to have you here, Steve, talking today about digital biomarkers and how do we get the quality real-world data sets we need for effective clinical trials. Bit of a mouthful, but I'm sure it's going to be very exciting. I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel today. So thank you very much, Steve, and welcome.
Well, good afternoon, evening, morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to facilitate this session, and I'm delighted to be joined by 3 experts in the field. First of all, I'll do some personal introductions, let everybody know who's on the panel today, and then we'll get right on into the discussion. So I'm Steve Parr, as Jacob mentioned. I'm a growth consultant working with innovative healthcare and medtech companies, and that tends to revolve around sales, funding, go-to-market, business development, and market access. I also sit as commercial expert on SBRI Healthcare Innovation Panel for the Wessex AHSN and a number of other hats. Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm a VP of product positioning at Signant Health. I've been working in e-clinical product development for around 20 years, but I'm also a scientist, and my area is clinical outcome assessments. So I've done recent scientific work for leading cross-industry research groups through the Critical Path Institute and also through the DIA on the use of wearables and sensors around clinical trials and clinical trial endpoints. So yeah, great to be here. Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you first to Steve and Thrive Wearables for putting together this panel. I'm excited to participate. My name is Kate Lydon. I am the Chief Science Officer at VivoSense, which for those of you who don't know, VivoSense is a data analytics and consulting company that specializes in real-world data from wearable sensors. We primarily work in the clinical trial space, but also venture into healthcare delivery at times as well. I joined VivoSense about 1.5 years ago now. And prior to that position, I spent most of my time in academia, but I've also worked for a couple of device manufacturers as well. So I've been kind of all over the board there. In academia, my research primarily focused on developing methods to process data from wearable sensors and also validating those methods. And then using those tools in high-risk patient populations to investigate how real-world behavior impacts risk for chronic disease. So super excited to be here today.
Thank you, Kate. And Miles.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for the invitation to the panel. It's a very interesting and relevant topic at the moment. So hello, everyone. My name's Miles Furness. I am the Global Digital Health Partnerships Lead at Ipsen Pharmaceuticals. I'm a physician by training. I was qualified in the UK and worked in the NHS for about 4 years, finishing up in oncology before shifting into industry where I've held commercial, medical and digital roles. passion very much is digital health and trying to bring in the right forms of technology, particularly into industry, to help improve patient outcomes and accelerate healthcare.
Thank you very much. So we talked about, Jacob reminded us what the title of the session is, and I'd really like to kick things off with the panel by asking you, what, from your experience of decentralized trials, what's really worked? For example, where clinical trial effectiveness has been greatly improved, or where real-world evidence and wearables have actually transformed the data quality and volume, or where new biomarkers have enabled different clinical endpoints. Or anything else that struck you directly from your experience of clinical trials? Anybody?
Well, let me kick it off then, Steve. I think in terms of effectiveness for decentralized trials, I've probably got a couple of just small examples, and I think at Signant Health, our technology solutions that we provide for clinical trials have applicability in decentralized trials as well as traditional studies. And so things like, direct-to-patient medication supply, eCOA can be used obviously at site or at home, remote assessments via video. So a couple of examples, one being the integration of home courier providers around a very large study which required stool sample collection alongside patient-reported outcomes. So a patient could use our app. They can complete their patient-reported outcomes diaries every day. And if they required a sample to be picked up, to be analysed, they could then trigger that courier interaction through the same app that they were collecting their patient-reported outcomes data. And at the same time as the collection occurring, of course, the new sample kit for the next sample was also provided to the patient. So this was a 15,000 patient study. So it would have been impractical to do this sort of thing, to ask patients to go somewhere, or to, it would have been hugely burdensome, I think, to operate in a way, that we, aside from this particular example. I think another example, a pediatric study needing daily IV injections for a period of time. They started out doing those injections at clinic, but getting the patient into clinic every day was obviously, again, burdensome both for the child and for the caregiver. And so after 3 days, they would then receive the injection packs delivered direct to their homes. A home nurse would arrive, they'd check the medication, they would administer the injection, and they do the drug accountability piece as well. So again, huge reduction again in burden for the patient and the caregiver. And I think just the final example, as we hit the COVID pandemic, earlier this year, and obviously still dealing with that now. Many of our clinical trials, in which we were collecting clinician-reported outcomes, so perhaps psychiatric ratings, where you might have a 20-minute interview with a psychiatrist face-to-face, and they would be assessing you for perhaps symptoms of depression or anxiety or something else. Those assessments would have been missed otherwise, because patients couldn't come into clinic due to self-isolating. But what we could do, of course, was do those over video and have remote assessments with the physician and the patient being able to interact in the same way that they would have done face-to-face, but over the video. So maybe just a few examples of where I think, there's huge potential. And, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole study has to be remote, but these remote study components can be really valuable in individual studies.
You touched on a really interesting point there, Bill, around the patient-reported outcomes piece and how it's becoming increasingly important, particularly for industry, to try and get access to that sort of insight. And the way that we historically or traditionally approach that, it's very ad hoc, it's very inconsistent. And what we're struggling with at the moment is within the data sets, if you look at a real-world evidence point of view, which is a huge step that's happened over the last couple of years, in particular, how we are able to access data in compliant ways, and suddenly we're recognizing the value of what we can do with this data. I can give a couple of examples just from a real-world evidence point of view, particularly in the US, where the FDA, I think, are real leaders in this space of adapting and advancing guidance around real-world evidence and what you can use it for, and understanding the value of that. And we've seen a couple of really key examples in, I think, from last year. Pfizer had a product that are actually able to expand their license off the back of some real-world evidence trials, combining that with phase 1 clinical data, which was absolutely pivotal. It's a huge step forward. The value of that for industry is vital. One of the things I do commonly see, however, is those PROs are often missed off because the traditional data, we just haven't really captured it in that digitalized way. So there's a huge gap that needs filling, and people are starting to almost input this now from normal clinic visits from patients. So we start capturing that. So we might be able to start using the data that we have there for synthetic trial control arms, for example, from the trial side. But until that happens at the moment, we're almost relying on prospective clinical trials with wearables and applications to capture these PROs that are hopefully validated to some form of quality of life outputs, that we can obviously then bring that in. But it's massively shifting. So I'm interested to see what else, from a PRO perspective, you've both been involved in as well.
So I'm going to shift away from PRO for a minute and just say that one of the areas that VivoSense has seen significant success has been in rare disease, specifically using what's called respiratory inductance plethysmography to measure respiratory outcomes in different disease states, including Rett syndrome and infant spinal muscular atrophy. And these are examples of endpoints that would not be feasible to have these people come into a site to measure. It's measured, during wake continuously. And so to have them in a clinic continuously for multiple days at a time, I mean, you could do an inpatient study, but that's just, 9 times out of 10 not feasible. And specifically in rare disease, where recruiting patients is difficult, and you often have to recruit from all over the world to be able to, expand your reach for the patients you can recruit by collecting these data at home, I think has really been significant. And these endpoints have been approved as both primary and secondary endpoints by different regulatory agencies. And I think that, this is traditionally a risk-averse field, but because it's rare disease, I think that they're willing to, bend a little bit. And of course, you need to provide, evidence of validation of this method in these groups, in this specific clinical populations. But I think that they're open to exploring these more innovative endpoints in rare disease. So.
Glad you brought up rare disease. So very much the focus from our organisation. We're a rare disease company, so I completely echo and agree everything you just said there. I think there's a real opportunity for us to get more involved and providing more services around these rare disease patients by capturing these new digital biomarkers we can start creating. I'm really interested to understand in the things that you've done. Have you got to a stage where within these trials you're starting to capture the additional data points you bring together, even within these populations, to start creating more prediction-like algorithms off the back of that, or at least within that conversation, because that's where these opportunities can lead to, right? Particularly within these subset populations within rare disease patients, it creates this huge opportunity to start building additional services around that. Have you come across that at any point to date?
We have not, and of course, I think all wearable sensors create that opportunity for these predictive algorithms to better predict onset and progression of disease. But in the specific rare disease state, we've not seen that. And I'd just also like to point out that I think that one of the extreme benefits for rare disease is that most of the time the endpoints are caregiver report. Right. And so being able to collect something objectively really can supplement those reports. I'm not suggesting replace them completely, but really being able to augment them and supplement them. I think that that's extremely valuable.
Some of you, I think, have touched on the issue of the pandemic as well, which has obviously created extra challenges. Bit of a simplistic question, but in terms of gauging the impact there, I mean, in some areas we've had previously up to 70%, 75% of trials failing in a pre-pandemic period. What has that done for normal, if you like, clinical trials? And perhaps with that extra question to Kate and Miles about in the rare disease area as well. What's the challenge that the pandemic has brought onto clinical trials in these straitened circumstances?
Do you want? So I'll tackle that first. I mean, I think the pandemic across the board has brought the challenge of getting patients into a clinic. Obviously, I mean that becomes a risky behavior for all studies, and so being able to measure these endpoints without bringing a patient in contact with potentially infectious other human beings is obviously great, and I think that folks are now much more open to considering these remote monitoring technologies. I won't say that I think that it has completely skyrocketed the use of these remote monitoring technologies in clinical trials, because even though they're interested, that infrastructure isn't there. You know, if they didn't have that set up from the beginning. So they're gaining interest in it and they're exploring it more. But I don't think we've really seen a huge spike in the use of these tools from the pandemic. And I'd be interested to hear what Miles and Bill have to say about that, if they've experienced the same thing as well.
Yeah, well, I think we have, but I would just to sort of answer Steve's question, you know, in terms of what has this brought in terms of the type of data that we're collecting. I think it's added variability to the data that we're collecting potentially, because, you know, we've had to adapt the way in which we're going to collect it. You know, we start out with a clinical trial with a very standardized approach. You know, we're going to collect the quality of life data, for example, at the site visit using a tablet computer, and they're going to be exactly the same for everybody. So you eliminate a number of different sources of variability. And then we have to adapt because of the pandemic, and people can't come into site anymore. So we're going to now say, okay, we don't want to stop the study. We're going to continue to collect that data, but perhaps one approach might be we're going to do telephone interviews to collect that data with the patient. Or another approach might be we use a web backup solution and the patients can access it themselves from home via the web in a less supervised manner. And while we believe that the data will be consistent and reliable, even when measured in that different approach, you know, there is that question as to whether we've introduced some additional variability and what the impact of that might have on the sensitivity of the study to show the treatment effects.
Miles, do you have any comment?
Just to echo what I think Kate just summarised there, it's been a really challenging time for industry over the last 9 months, and I think we lose sight that the people that have been affected by this has been pretty challenging, and it's not just for the trials, for the treatment as well. DataCam, one of our UK data hubs, released a study just looking at the reduction of people being diagnosed with cancers and coming in for therapy. And some of those things you can't avoid, and that relates to some of these trials, right? They have to come into centres. So how do we pivot? And as Kate's mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. It's this huge infrastructure that needs to be adapted. And if trials are already started, then it's going back and almost trying to amend protocols and things, which is, you know, very, very difficult to do. It takes time. So I agree. I haven't seen a huge shift, but I don't think it's because of the unwillingness or understanding now the relevance, how the world is changing and the importance and impact this can have going forward. I just think that it's going to take a bit more time for people to really shift and think about this in a very different way, like we've been forced to over the last 12 months. So I very much expect over the next couple of years to see greater uptake from a wearable and a remote monitoring perspective.
Yeah, and I'll just give an example somewhat of what Bill was mentioning, that we've experienced a lot of folks that have ongoing clinical trials that use in-clinic 6-minute walk tests as an endpoint. So many trials use that. And a lot of sponsors have reached out to us of how can we measure that remotely? And of course, we have wearable accelerometers, different types of kinematic sensors that we can use to measure things about movement and gait and behavior. But we all know that the in-clinic 6-minute walk test is standardized, right? Like, this is a standard performance test, and being able to conduct that in the real world, it's not possible. Yes, there are other things that you can measure that are related to that. But to exactly mimic the 6-minute walk test out of clinic that's essentially impossible. And so we've had a lot of folks interested in doing that, and they come to us and what can we do? And we do have, VivoSense has an endpoint that we call best 6-minute effort, which we relate to the in-clinic test. It's essentially a real world parallel of the 6-minute walk test, but that of course is not the same thing. And so they're interested in that, but then for them to think about how do I shift my trial operationally to be able to collect this, that's been a real barrier for people.
Poses that interesting question of, are these endpoints fit for purpose anymore? We're moving towards this piece, right? And then it drives into, okay, well, if we need to define something that is more fit for purpose, how do we go about that to ensure the community, the scientific community, can trust it, will accept it within clinical literature, and then be able to use that as a new standard of care? And this is, I think we will all agree that we see this again and again at the moment, that it's still very much a learning that we're experiencing, but hopefully, given everything that's been going on recently, it's going to drive people to actually start exploring this and taking it more seriously, to really start validating these additional endpoints, which arguably could be more accurate and more clinically valid than what we've used historically.
Yeah. And certainly more real world. No, it's interesting. I was talking last week to a VP of project management for a global CRO, and he was echoing your comments, really, that the pandemic has shone a light, really, on the greater need for decentralized trials, real world evidence, etc. But this, as you said, Kate, the usage has not skyrocketed. There's something getting in the way. And that, I think, really is at the core of what this session is about. So I'd just like to move the conversation on just a tad, but continue with the same theme. I'd like to explore what is slowing and preventing the wider use of remote monitoring and the uptake, as you said, Miles, about more or new biomarkers. How better real-world evidence and wearables can support this better data moving forward. Can we really burrow down into that? What's getting in the way? Because the pandemic is such a driver. I mean, obviously clinically driver, but to be blunt, financially as well. There's a lot of money and inefficiency brought into the system. Let's just burrow down into what's slowing down the uptake.
I think just adding to my previous point around, we're in this scenario where we're able to collect a lot of data, a lot of objective data, sometimes passively, continuously. This very exciting phase where we can do all of this, and the accessibility has just shot through the roof. The problem with it is trying to correlate it to a relevant phenotype, something that we can clinically validate against what historically has been defined as standard of care. And that's something I've mentioned previously, that unfortunately that standard of care may not be clinically appropriate anymore. Because is it really a gold standard? Like the traditional biomarkers we use has been established using averages or heterogeneous populations, and trying to compare that with more digital biomarkers, it might not necessarily be a fair assessment. That's really difficult, because if everyone knows something, and that's what I clinically believe, that is the marker, that's what we've used for decades to assess this patient population or this clinical assessment or whatever, to then try and completely say, well, actually it's not fit for purpose, but if we validated it against that, we're getting lots of false negatives because it's not fit. What do we do? How do we start building that confidence and that trust that physicians and researchers are going to be able to use that now as a future gold standard going forward? And that for me requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, a lot of adaptability in this space. It's very, very, very difficult to do that.
And it also raises the issue, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, Bill, about wearable or actual device selection as well.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the barriers to perhaps the adoption, the sort of at scale adoption of wearables and sensors for clinical measures is exactly that. You know, what sort of evidence do we need to provide to a regulatory body to support the approach that we've taken to defend the particular device we've selected? And you know, there has been a lot of work done on this. There's a number of different consortia. You know, there's the Critical Path Institute, there's the CTTI group, there's DIME, there's a DIA, and quite a lot of these groups have come up with very similar approaches to how we might address that evidence piece. But I think that's the point. Is a sponsor organisation is going to be conservative and going to have questions about whether their data would be accepted at the end of the day. And so we know there are a number of things that we need to demonstrate, and it's whether we can actually pull that package of data together quickly enough to be able to do it. So, is the sensor itself providing raw measurements or raw data that's kind of accurate or reliable? Can we analytically validate the outcome measures that it produces? So if it's counting steps, can we demonstrate that in the particular patient population we're interested in, it's counting steps accurately or to enough accuracy that would be sufficient for a clinical endpoint? And then, the other point, I think, to some of the things Miles was talking about, some of the endpoint properties, we need to start to understand. So, one would be, do we understand what a meaningful change is in that endpoint? And again, going back to the kind of the rather substandard way we do this, we usually do that by comparing it to a gold standard, which we think we understand what a meaningful change is. And again, if we're not measuring exactly the same thing, or if the gold standard isn't actually very good, it becomes quite a difficult exercise to generate those endpoint properties that we need to support the use of that endpoint in a clinical trial. So, for me, that's one of the big barriers, I think. And but I do think we've moved a long way in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of understanding what's needed and how to do it. And I think that will start to drive adoption.
Kate, any thoughts?
Yeah, so that last point that Bill made there about we've come a long way, I would say that even in this past year, it feels like we've come a long way. Just the discussions that you hear folks having on panels like this, it feels like we've come a long way in talking about validation and what pieces of validation do we need, because I mean, for me, that and for VivoSense, that's at the foundation of everything we do. As Bill mentioned, counting steps. And the reality of it is that most of these step counting algorithms were developed in healthy populations. We need, at the end of the day, if we want to get our drug or whatever it is approved by different regulatory agencies, we need to, and we're using steps as an endpoint, we need to show evidence that we believe that we're counting steps accurately and that our tool is sensitive to change in that measurement as well. And we know that, patients with Parkinson's disease their gait is different than a patient with multiple sclerosis or ataxia or whatever it might be. So I think that it feels like we've made progress in that validation space and people at least having discussions around what's important, I think, is really important. But and to go back up to the point about clinical validity and being able to establish what is the minimal clinically important difference for this group, I think the reality of it, that's a barrier, but the reality of it is that this is still early days for these tools. And so that evidence and that evidence base is not there in most instances. And I know that this is a dirty word, but I like to promote pilot studies, natural history studies. Like, let's gather these data on these patient populations so that we can begin to gather that evidence needed to establish a minimal clinically important difference. Because at the end of the day, we're going to need evidence to support that when we're, submitting our protocol to whoever it might be. So yeah, I think we're making progress. But I think also I would encourage the field to not be afraid of, I think, small steps in that spectrum of progress.
Yeah, and Kate, I think I can kind of link to that idea around interpretation, because I guess minimal clinically important difference is all about interpreting the findings. And the other challenge I think we have is that we don't necessarily understand whether an endpoint is device specific. So for example, if I measure total number of steps per day using a Fitbit, I know I'm going to get a slightly different answer than if I use a Garmin or if I use an Apple Watch or something else. And so it's difficult for us to interpret these changes within an individual clinical trial, but when it comes to a regulator or a payer looking at data from different development programs or perhaps measuring what they think is the same endpoint but using a different device, it's very hard to find a way to accurately compare the results across perhaps different drug programs, for example. And so I kind of feel that's maybe less of a barrier for us looking at individual drug programs, but certainly a barrier for regulators and payers in terms of understanding how to interpret the data we provide.
I absolutely agree in that if this is validated in a Garmin, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's validated in a Fitbit or an Actigraph or whatever it might be. So I think that is absolutely a consideration that needs to be taken into account.
To what extent? Sorry, Miles, over to you.
Very, very quick point, just to kind of take on from what you both highlighted on a slightly different tangent, is that taking these sort of devices and wearables you're describing and identifying these other endpoints, I think one thing that everyone's overlooks that we're aware of but don't really take it hugely into consideration is that this is personalizing in a way that we've never been able to do before, and it's very different to how we do healthcare. A lot of healthcare is really umbrella-like approach in a lot of what we do, and all of a sudden we're able to start getting insights in full population, but then look at an individual and personalizing it to a point of view that it's going to completely change the conversation. And physicians are going to suddenly be guided by what these wearables and what these digital biomarkers are telling them, not from a population, but for their individual patients that are opposite them, but then have to suddenly trust and change a whole different way of how they approach their diagnosis, or what therapies they're going to pick, or how that individual is progressing over time or improving over time, and whatever marker that's relevant to them. It opens up like this whole other lens of this is a different way of doing healthcare. And it's great, it's brilliant, it's exactly what we want to be moving towards. But that's a huge culture shift, right? That's a huge barrier around how do we get people to start thinking that way, that we can believe and trust what we're validating and believe and trust what endpoints that we're coming up with, and then trying to say, well, yeah, but this patient is going to be slightly different to the other patient you've got next in your clinic. They might be really different, but they're telling you very different things, even though it might be the same endpoint. It's a very different, I haven't summarized that extremely well, but it's a very different approach. I think we overlook it sometimes because we just get so into it. But it's an extremely important point of how we're going to need to approach this in the future.
Yeah, the opportunity for personalized data is absolutely phenomenal. And also getting back to the practicalities of clinical trials, just in terms of patient engagement and patient retention as well. If you can do remote monitoring, these are all the goals that we're all aiming for, and I guess it's a sort of well-trod point. But going back to the previous point, if that's where we're heading, how do you broker this device variability? There is such a large reliance at the moment on the off-the-shelf. And often I get a little bit disappointed and depressed, really. People will use the standard products in a certain area because it has a track record. And part of the track record is knowing what the deficiencies are. And I get a little bit frustrated at this side of the chasm while we wait and we use the pre-used wearables and the regulatorily authorized ones. But in actual fact, there's a whole world out there which is, new endpoint focused, patient focused. How do we broker that? I mean, you talked before, Kate, about making small steps, which I do appreciate. But at some point, if you think of the millions involved, the expense of a clinical trial, surely it's worth doing a little bit more R&D and branching out in a new direction. I hope that's not too provocative, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, my immediate thought is that I would challenge everyone in the field to eliminate this phrase "off the shelf" from your vocabulary, because I just don't think I won't say 100% of the time, but 99.9% of the time, there's not an off-the-shelf solution for you. Like as Miles was saying, this is very patient-focused. This is personalized. Everything needs to be relevant for the patient population. And these sensor technologies, when you're collecting data at such high resolution, to get down to the nitty-gritty, the filter matters, right? Like the way that you're filtering the signal, the way that you're cleaning it, the way that you process it. There's, even within one device, there's multiple ways to derive an endpoint. So it's not even just between devices, but sometimes within a device. And I don't say that to scare people away from using these tools because the variability is too great and we don't know what we're getting. I say that to encourage folks to just really, think about and be thoughtful about how they're using them, and to engage others who have used these tools in a way that is similar to how they intend to use them, because there are people out there that have experience using these tools, and this is a new space for everyone. So I think, the more we can create the communication across organizations, then the more that I think people will start to really adopt that approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. I won't tell you how many times I've heard the word "off the shelf" in the last year. It will be quite depressing. Sorry, Bill, did you want to come in?
Well, I think just to add to what Kate said, and I guess coming from the patient-reported outcome side of the industry, we've faced this problem already because we've moved things from paper instruments, which have been well validated. They have a certain, certain format, a certain look and feel. We've put them onto electronic devices, and they might look and feel very different. We might change the way that a scale operates, for example. And we've done a lot of work to validate the fact that the measurement properties of that validated instrument haven't changed when we've moved it into a different format. And the same is true here. So this is what we're talking about. Can we demonstrate that the measurement properties of different devices are close enough so that they don't have a significant material impact on the endpoint measurement? And so it's almost down to endpoint developers to start to identify what are the tolerances in the inputs that are acceptable, that won't have a huge difference, make a huge impact on the endpoint measure itself, but you could accept. So I've got a step counter and I've got another one which has got a bias of 1%. Well, does that make a difference, a material impact on my clinical endpoint? Because if it doesn't, then I'm okay to switch that device and use a different one and measure that same endpoint and feel that actually my data will be comparable between those two different devices. But we don't really understand that yet, and it's probably very endpoint specific in terms of what those tolerances need to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see we're getting towards the end of our session, so thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. If you'll forgive the cliche, I'd just like to ask you each in turn, what's the one thing, what's at the top of your list that is going to have the greatest impact if implemented, greatest impact in terms of improving clinical trial effectiveness and getting real world evidence into the cycle? Bill, alphabetically.
There you go. I think using these tools to get richer insights into our therapies and into our treatments. So, examples might be collecting data more frequently from home. So measuring tremor in a Parkinson's patient, I'm able to do it every day, and I'm able to look at the number of days when they have tremor and the number of the days they don't. It's a better picture than the monthly or the 2 weekly visit to the clinician's office. Or maybe I instrument a clinic performance test. So I've got a timed up and go test, which normally my clinician would use a stopwatch to figure out how long it takes someone to get up, walk 3 meters, turn around and go back and sit back down again. And that's a good endpoint. But if I put sensors on that person, I can then measure all sorts of aspects of how they conduct that movement. And in particular, the way they turn, that 180-degree turn, the number of steps they take, how balanced they are. That can tell me a lot more about perhaps their risk of falling when they go back home than perhaps just the simple measure of how long it took them to get up and sit back down again. So I kind of feel richer insights is my key takeaway.
Kate?
Yeah, I feel like this is a tough question, and I don't want to repeat exactly what Bill just said. But being able to collect information about a person in their real world, right? Like we can do these tests in a clinic and they can perform well on a 6-minute walk test, but does that translate to how they're actually living in their real world? I think being able to look at endpoints or biomarkers through that lens of what the patient is actually doing and how they're doing it in their life, I think that really is exciting, and I hope that continues to really motivate people to use these tools moving forward.
Taking all the good ones, guys. It is a really difficult question. From my perspective, from where I am currently, I think that everything that everyone said here today is completely true, and I think it all needs to be taken into consideration. But there needs to be an element of open-mindedness to take a bit more risk and explore in this area, and thinking how, when we doing these sort of trials, identifying these new endpoints, we're really thinking how can we add more value, and how can we bring that back into the healthcare system. And that's something that we're seeing already. There's lots of little examples of that, but I'd like to just continue seeing it, and people really going out there and exploring, thinking, particularly from an industry point of view, around new business models. How can we start building this into a business model? How can we start closing the loop? How can we start increasing value of what we're offering by capturing these new endpoints and these new data, objective data points within each individual in the real world? That is, we can personalize and hopefully start adding some prediction prevention around that service to add more value eventually.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting session. Thank you for your time. I've certainly learned a lot. I'd just like to say for any of the audience, if you'd like to get in touch with any of our panelists, or if you've got further questions, please do so via the Giant Health website, or as Jacob mentioned earlier, the Giant Health page on the Thrive website, thrivewearables.com. And I think we've now got time for 20 minutes of live Q&A. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much.
We have had a fantastic show so far, and it's been great to listen to this track today and to hear the questions for the panel from this last session. I'm going to welcome back now live Steve Parr to continue the discussion. Please do take a moment to think about any questions you have for the panel, and for Steve and Miles especially. We're having some challenges connecting the other participants at the moment, and we will get through those questions. We'd love to pitch those out live as we go. But until then, I'm going to welcome back Miles and Steve, who will start the ball rolling, I suspect. Steve.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Indeed.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so thank you. Welcome back to everybody after that excellent panel session. We've got 20 minutes of live Q&A at the moment. So as Jacob mentioned, unfortunately, we've got a couple of our panel members struggling to log back into the Q&A. But Miles, Jacob and myself will do our best. So Miles, can I kick off with the first question, if that's okay with you?
Of course, absolutely.
How much of a barrier is the lack of regulatory approval for some sensors and wearables? To what extent can the right hybrid trial protocol design and or the right data collection and or post-analysis make up for the lack of full regulatory approval?
Yeah, super interesting. So yes, it is a bit of a barrier. I think there's an understanding there that this is a rapidly changing space, particularly around the regulatory piece. We're getting increasing guidance that's making it easier to get that, to build that trust and to build that credibility with the sort of protocols that we are designing. What I'm seeing is, particularly for myself, in some of the things that we've done, these protocols are different. And you get a lot of challenges internally, and that's perfectly normal. And I think that's a good thing from all different functions, because it is an unusual way to start collecting new insights and new data in particular. How we then sort of turn that into clinically validated to standard of care. How do we bring that in so people can say, okay, right, well, this is what we've done historically. This is what we've got now. How can we try and bring this together so that it is going to be credible within the scientific community, that it is going to achieve the endpoints that we want to achieve, that we are actually exploiting the sort of insights that we can generate from this now, and start thinking a little bit more outside the box rather than the traditional tunnel vision I think that we sometimes trapped ourselves into, because it's just how we've always done or taken this approach. But it is changing, and I think there's some brilliant people in the space and some fantastic people in the industry who are really, really open-minded, particularly around the stats side, how we can try and pull this together. And so, yes, although it is a barrier, I think it is becoming easier as time has progressed.
Okay, thank you. Kate, welcome to the Q&A. Glad you could join us from Denver.
Thank you.
I believe you've had some technical problems, so apologies for that. But in at the deep end, then I apologise. I guess you didn't catch the question, but hopefully. First question was, how much of a barrier is the lack of regulatory approval for some sensors and wearables? To what extent can the right hybrid trial protocol design and or the right data collection and or the right post-analysis make up for the lack of full regulatory approval?
So I guess I need a little clarification. When you say regulatory approval, you mean regulatory approval of the device, the protocol?
Exactly, the sensors and the wearables themselves. It sort of touches on the conversation we had earlier, didn't we, about off the shelf. And I think you memorably said 99.9% of the time don't go for off the shelf because they're not suitable. And so this question, I think, quite eloquently captures that quandary, doesn't it? You've got something that's off the shelf and approved. In your opinion, 99.9% of the time, they're not really suitable to the trial. So I think that's what we're talking about, approval of the sensors and the wearables.
Yeah, so I think that, the FDA has 510K clearance for devices or algorithms or whatever it might be. And we've heard the FDA over and over again say that, a 510K clearance is granted within a very specific context, right? Like in a very specific patient population, in a very specific data collection procedure, processing, those sorts of things. And so when somebody takes a tool and tries to use it in their specific study, in their specific patient population, that 510K clearance no longer pertains to what they're doing. And so we've had experience where a small pilot study collecting that analytical validation prior to starting a full, phase 2 or 3 trial has really been beneficial, and the regulatory agencies are open to that, to accepting those small studies that show really strong validation evidence in your specific context of use, your specific patient population, your specific setting in which you'll be collecting those data. So I think that the fact that these devices don't have regulatory approval isn't necessarily a barrier. We just need to think about it differently in how we get our protocols to the FDA or whatever regulatory agency.
Yeah, no, I think it was an excellent question. If it's not bending the rules too much, I think the questioner has suggested that where there is the lack of approval, what can the protocol design, data collection, and post-analysis make up? Is there anything you would add to that list then, if you're in that position? That list of three, sort of.
Protocol design. What was the other one?
Protocol design, data collection, and then the right protocol collection and post-analysis.
Yeah, I think there are some subcategories within those. Like those are the broad categories, but certainly thinking about like specifications and settings on a device, so that sometimes there are multiple ways you can configure a device for data collection. So thinking about the most appropriate way to do that, thinking about cleaning your data as it comes in. These are high resolution data sets oftentimes. And so being able to manage artifact or noise in the signal, that is bad data that you don't want to count in your analyses. So I think, it's a subcategory of processing, I guess, but really thinking about how you clean these data is very important.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Miles, at all?
No, I wouldn't actually. That was quite a nice summary.
That's what I thought as well. I think we have our... Before we move on, I was just wondering if Bill was going to emerge. Hello, Bill.
Hey there. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Hi, Steve.
I'm not sure we can see you. Can we see you? Can we see and hear Bill? Okay, technical people. Or do you want me to move on to the next question? Bill, welcome. Can we hear you, Bill?
I think so.
We can indeed. Great. Okay. So, at the risk of boring the audience, welcome, Bill. I know you're having technical problems there, and it's not your fault at all. But Miles and Kate have just been looking at the first question, so I'll offer it to you. And perhaps, seeing as I'm reading this out for the third time, if you can be fairly succinct. But first question was, how much of a barrier is the lack of regulatory approval for some sensors and wearables? To what extent can the right hybrid trial protocol design and/or the right data collection and/or good post-analysis make up for the lack of regulatory approval?
Yeah, I don't think devices need regulatory approval for use in clinical trials. So I would say they need to meet certain properties around accuracy and reliability, and I guess usability in the population that you're looking at. So it's really down to the protocol developers, the clinical developers, to be able to evidence that a device is suitable for use, i.e. that it meets these accuracy criteria, and whether it has a market approval or not, I think it doesn't matter. I don't know if that's what others said. Having not heard other people's answers.
No, those were unique pearls of wisdom, Bill.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Okay. Second question, what is the greatest benefit you see in this potential for decentralized trials and real world experience? Is it in the improved clinical data? Is it in saving money? Or is it in improved operational performance, such as patient engagement and retention, or shorter timescales? Do you want me to read that question again, or?
Well, I think it's in increased convenience to participate. So, I think that's the biggest driver. Will it be better quality data? I don't think so. There may actually be more variability in the data because we're not able to always supervise how the data are collected, but we can collect data more frequently. But I think it's really about, for me, convenience. And we've seen this in the COVID, pandemic. Patients either can't or don't feel comfortable attending site, and to be able to conduct assessments remotely in the home is a way through that. And patient recruitment is a huge issue for all clinical trials, and so being able to participate in a trial in a way that's convenient to you, i.e. not having to go to hospital once every 2 weeks or give up working time to do that, is a real bonus, I think. So convenience, I think, is the one for me.
Anyone else wish to add to that?
Go ahead, Miles.
You, Kate. Now after you, please.
Okay. I'm going to disagree with Bill.
Thank you, Kate. No offense, Bill.
For me, it's I don't want to call it improved clinical data. I want to call it different data, being able to capture things that we weren't previously able to capture. I think that is really what motivates me to work in this space. The idea that these tools can lead to better outcomes for patients, I think that's what I'm hanging my hat on, and that's what how I see it.
I'm going to have a massive cop out and say it's a combination of everything, right? Because I think it is. I think that there's clear benefit across the board, right? I don't think we're going to see huge benefit and improvement in all these areas. That's going to be the thing. I think it's going to be more multifactorial in the sense that, yes, it's going to save time. Yes, it's going to be more convenient to an extent. Yes, we're going to capture new data. There's that opportunity. Maybe we increase the volume of that data because we get more people recruited, potentially, which again is a bit of a trade-off on some of the quality potentially. But it is thinking about it in a very different way. And I think it's very difficult to compare. And that's the danger, I think, in a way. We've got to be cautious of how we're sort of comparing it to previous approaches. And think about, okay, this is a very different way of trying to capture all of this. But certainly from an industry perspective, if we can save time, therefore we can save money, it allows us to do more and it allows us to get outcomes out faster. So it really helps support that product or that asset. So there's a huge advantage there from an industry perspective, which is why we're seeing a huge uptake.
Thank you very much. I see there's another question. I'd be fascinated in the answer. It may be, sorry to put you on the spot, Kate, it may be more you than the others, or I may be wrong. Are you familiar with the V3 approach, Kate?
Yes.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. That was the right answer. So, the question is quite succinct, and I think those in the know see this as a bit of a way forward in answering this. So the question is, unlike the other questions, is the V3 approach the answer? Now, let's assume that no one else actually knows what the implications of that are. So if you could explain and then go on to answer, and I think that will also allow the other panelists time to assemble their answers as well. So apologies for putting you on the spot, but over to you, Kate.
Okay, sure. So you're asking me to explain what V3 is first?
Well, the question is the V3 approach the answer to these issues? But yes, I would ask you to explain for those not in the know what the V3 approach is, please.
Sure. I guess my response to that question immediately, though, is what's the question? Is it the answer to what question?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, about getting over the chasm, I think is what they mean, to get these better decentralized trials. And, the panel earlier, we talked about what the barriers were.
Okay.
And this is saying is the V3 approach, which is putting, apart from your esteemed opinions, putting an actual process behind this to get us to the other side of the chasm, and able to use much wider range of sensors and endpoints and that sort of thing.
Sure. So the V3 approach, just really quickly, is a 3-step process to validation for these tools. So the first part of the V3 is called verification, and that's basically validating the device at the sensor level. So is what we're getting from the sensor accurate? And then the second step of V3 is analytical validation. So when we put this sensor on a person and we apply some sort of data processing and algorithms to that signal from that sensor, are we estimating or are we measuring steps, for example, accurately? Are we measuring what we think we're measuring from this device? And then the third step is clinical validation, which is essentially, does this endpoint have clinical meaning in this patient population? And I think that the V3 framework, I love the V3 paper. I'm the biggest proponent of it because we always talk about validation. I always talk about validation. And the V3 paper, I think, has really put out this framework that allows folks to be on the same page and to really discuss validation using the same types of language. which I think is really helpful. And so I don't know that the V3 framework is the answer, but I think it is a fantastic framework to, phrase this discussion amongst people in the field.
Yeah, I agree, Kate. I think it's one of a few pieces of work that have tried to help to provide recommendations around the kind of evidence you need to support the use of a sensor and a clinical endpoint based on sensor data. I think the limitation that I see is that the verification step, the kind of sensor level validation, is hard to find, is hard to get hold of. Particularly if you're using proprietary sensors. So relying on that piece, I wouldn't want that to be seen as a barrier if people can't get hold of that verification data. My personal feeling is that with good analytical validation and clinical validation, you've probably got enough actually to be comfortable with an endpoint. But if you've got the verification data, I mean, that's just solid. That'd be really good.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I think that the verification step is more for people that are thinking about doing analytical validation themselves. And if you're going to partake in this analytical validation, it makes sense for you to go through the verification process first and then move on to analytical validation. But I definitely agree. If you're able to prove through analytical validation that what you're getting accurately compares to a reference standard, then.
Thanks very much. Miles, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I'll be honest with you, I'm not overly familiar with the process, but I assume you're referring to the Nature paper that was published this year, the 3D process. Yeah. So I'm not super familiar with it, but the one question I recall that came out of it was around the first verification step of who's going to be responsible for it all. From a regulatory point of view as well, there's this huge gap, and that would be my initial concern. But without, again, sort of being overly familiar with it, I wouldn't add too much more because I think Bill and Kate have done a wonderful job.
Agreed. Thank you, Miles. Next question. Is it better to start a decentralized trial? Sorry, Kate. Is it better to start a decentralized trial sooner with an off-the-shelf sensor and clean the potentially noisy data afterwards, or to wait a little and develop more custom sensors that better match the trial endpoints and clinical requirements and the trial patient ergonomics? So I suspect there's yes, that sounds like a sort of delay now or delay later.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to think about what's your end goal, keeping the end in mind. We always say that, right? Is the tool, are you confident that the tool and the methods that you're using you have sufficient evidence to support, your endpoint at the end of the day when you're going to try to move on to another later stage trial or regulatory agency or whoever it might be? I really think that you need to keep that in mind. I think that I don't know if it's an alternative approach or just a little bit differently, is if you have a tool that you think is valuable, but you may not have all the validation evidence, putting it in as an exploratory endpoint to start to gather some data might not be a bad idea. Again, doing a small pilot study isn't a bad idea. And I don't think that we need custom sensors. I think that we need custom methods and approaches. So just to clarify on that a little bit.
Interesting.
I think, Kate, some of that might be also down, just thinking about activity as an example, and the granularity of data that you can get from a sensor might impact your ability to kind of post hoc look at different endpoints or different measures from the data. So, for example, if I'm just using a step counter that just gives me total steps a day, well, that's kind of what I'm stuck with. But if I'm getting something that's giving me a 1 minute window of every minute, this is some sort of activity that's done every minute, then I can start to look at other things like bouts of walking or other things that I might not have thought about. So I suppose your ability to kind of go back and re-look at the data with a new set of eyes depends upon the sensor's ability to kind of support this, how granular the data it can provide, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that. I mean, I know some of the inactivity, for example, some of the research grade devices actually give you the raw accelerations so you can go back to, so you could apply your own algorithms to those as well if you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you're thinking of this. So I was thinking more in terms of like the data processing steps. So not necessarily thinking of a different endpoint that I wish I chose instead of steps per day, looking at bouts or something. I was more thinking about the methods in the way that we collect these data, the settings that we collect them in, how we clean the data, how we process the data, those sorts of things. So certainly I've been on, approached by folks, whether in pharma or academia or wherever it is, that have collected data and they've collected it in some way and they come to you at the end and they say, this is what I intended to do. Here's my data. How do I do that? And it's like, you missed a whole lot of steps, prior to starting this trial that now prohibits you from getting where you wanted to go. So that's what I worry about. And that's what I think about. And I think activity data is a great example. I mean, being able to go back to the raw data, that should be something that folks look for when using a wearable accelerometer, for sure.
Yeah, excellent point. Miles?
Yeah, this is one of the questions, right? When you're designing said protocol, it's ensuring that you're capturing all those exploratory endpoints and what you actually want to look at within the data that you're going to capture. There's, and I don't know whether you've experienced this as well, there's this missed opportunity sometimes where how do you do that in that kind of traditional sense to ensure you're doing it compliantly from when you're designing a clinical trial to ensure that you are, and obviously adhering to data privacy laws as well, that you're capturing the right data with the right device and the right amount of it, because that's what you want to look at, and therefore you sort of limit yourself as to how could we potentially look as a sort of retrospectively explore, like you would do in other areas, but in healthcare it's slightly different. I don't know if you've experienced any of that previously, but it's certainly something that I have seen. I think we overlook, and it's kind of, you can't go back and try and get access to that. It's just impossible. You can't do that, and therefore you miss said opportunity. And it just kind of gets missed. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before. And that is like you explained, it all comes down to that methodology when you first start and really thinking about, okay, what do you want to look at? What can we grasp? How are we going to capture it? How are we going to analyze it? There just seems to be a bit of a knowledge gap, a lack of understanding as to what we really can do with it and what we really need to be looking at. I don't know whether that's consistent with your experiences as well.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much. We've actually slightly overrun our time, but that was an excellent discussion. I wish you could have gone on longer, and extremely grateful to Kate along the way there for actually disagreeing at some point, which always makes for a much more interesting event. No offense to the guys. So thank you again to the panelists. I've certainly learned a lot over the panel and the Q&A. Thanks very much for your time and your insights, and also to the audience for tuning in. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to connect with our panelists, if you've got further questions or for whatever reason, please do so via the Giant Health conference track webpage, or indeed via the Giant 2020 page on the Thrive Wearables website, thrivewearables.com. So once again, thanks very much, Bill, Kate, and Miles, for a very interesting session. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, guys.
Thank you, Steve, as well, for hosting the session today. And yeah, really fascinating conversation. Thanks, everyone. And please stay on for the next conference session that we'll be running just shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
So welcome everyone to today's session, and welcome to Giant if it's the first session you're seeing, or welcome back if you've been here for the days preceding this. Thrive have been here for 3 years now at the Giant Health Show, and we're delighted to come back again to bring new speakers to the floor, and in this case obviously in slightly different conditions. So we're really happy to have 5 sessions running at this year's Giant Health Show. And this is the last of those sessions, and we have some excellent speakers today talking about a subject that's fascinating from a theoretical point of view and in terms of how technologies are coming on board that relate to sleep and making us aware and helping us to sleep. It's going to be a fascinating conversation, I'm sure. Just a bit of intro to Thrive. We're a design and development consultancy based in the UK. And we really specialise in creating technologies that have impact in terms of health and wellness. We really look to work in a collaborative way to create new technologies that leverage sensors and data and the Internet of Things as it emerges in the health space. Really excited to talk to people who share that interest and want to connect in relation to that. So the session today will be followed by a Q&A where you'll be able to ask questions of the speakers. Please do get in touch as the discussion progresses and get your questions ready for us, and we'll try and get through them all at the end. And yeah, I think with that, I'm going to hand over to the panel to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Michael Larson. Would you like to introduce yourself, please, sir?
Sure. I am Michael Larson, and my interest in wearables took off when I was confronted with needing to help someone that I love very much. My daughter had a chronic health problem, and pharmaceuticals clearly were not the best option for treating her. And it was clear to me that seeking ways to leverage technology to work naturally with our body was a good way forward, and I think a way that everyone here can appreciate. I am a professor by day of mechanical engineering. I earned my PhD from MIT. And right now I have a particular interest in sleep, and whereas that might not seem to naturally go together, again, this relationship between technology and helping people naturally is motivating my interests at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. I'd like to introduce now Rachel Wingfield. Would you like to introduce yourself, Rachel?
Yeah, great. So thank you for inviting me here. So I'm an artist and designer of experiences. I studied many, many years ago at the Royal College of Art, and I was looking at responsive environments. And my work was very much looking at smart textiles and integrating electronics into textiles well over a decade ago. And my interest back then, whilst I was studying, was really looking at light as medicine. So I was really researching issues around seasonal affective disorder, which I think we're all experiencing right now, and how you could use light to kind of really remedy that. So I was really integrating light into fabric. Many years down the line, I've continued to work with ideas around sort of well-being and health, and how we can create responsive environments and situations where the public can come together and engage with a scientific discourse and learn and share information around different areas of well-being, from sleep to your diet, to different ways of sort of living healthily and happily together. So a lot of the work that I do now as an artist has been through a collaborative studio called Loop.ph, and we really look at restorative placemaking, where we create these environments in which people can really relax and go through different meditation techniques, and we really look at the different ways to control the environment in order to kind of put ourselves into sort of a relaxed state and a place of kind of sharing. I've now turned my art studio, not here, this is very messy, but I've turned my art studio into a public kind of wellness place. It's quite experimental, but we run sessions throughout the week, where people can come, they can do gong baths, we do create different kind of sound and light environments. We look at sort of well-being and mindful fitness and movement. So we're just looking at wellness on lots of different levels and invite different practitioners to come and experiment So sleep is something that I'm kind of really interested in on a personal level. I've had insomnia for most of my life, and I've been trying to understand and look at different ideas around sleep, why I'm not sleeping. I've actually come to the conclusion that it's okay. I don't perhaps need to sleep as much as other people do. I'm kind of really interested in sharing what I've learned, but it's very much from a personal perspective. How do we deal with issues around anxiety, different mental health issues and how they relate to sleep? So yeah, I'm here to sort of share my experience as an artist. So thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. And Lizzie Hill, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Lizzie Hill. I'm a lecturer in sleep medicine at the University of Oxford, and I'm coming from a slightly different background in that my background's in healthcare science. So having worked as a clinical physiologist for the last 20 years, specialising in the diagnosis and treatment of sleep disorders in various different clinical and academic settings based in Edinburgh. I'm obviously passionate about promoting healthy sleep, and I'm now a full-time educator in the field. And I'm based at the Oxford Online Programme in Sleep Medicine, which is one of the first online programmes to come out of the University of Oxford. It's been running for 5 years now, so we were slightly ahead of the game in the online teaching field. But we have a course that's a 2-year master's programme, which is open to anyone with a professional interest in sleep medicine. So as well as my role within the online programme in sleep medicine, I'm currently the education lead for the British Sleep Society, which is a multidisciplinary organisation for sleep professionals, and I'm also president of the European Society of Sleep Technologists. So I'm coming from quite a clinical and academic perspective, and also from a teaching side of things. So I have a lot of experience in sleep diagnostics, so I'm really excited to be on this very interesting panel of people with a lot of interest in sleep diagnostics today. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you all for the introductions. What a broad panel we have. I'm really fascinated to see where the conversation goes. I'm going to start actually by asking you, Michael, because of my sort of understanding of the technologies and the sort of development of those things. I'm really interested about the measurement of sleep and what you can see when a person is sleeping. And it may be useful for our audience to kind of get a fix on that. You have a product in the market that is about sleep and about measuring sleep. I remember talking with Tim Antos at Kokoon about sleep technologies and how the intelligent kind of interaction with sleep cycles was a really sort of a hotbed for innovation. Can you tell us a bit about sleep signals and the cycles of sleep and how those two things kind of meet?
Sure. And whereas I'm sure Lizzie includes this in her course, no doubt, but for healthy sleepers, we typically go through a number of cycles regarding our brain activity during the course of a night. And a healthy sleeper will maybe have 4 or 5 of these cycles typically. And it all has to do with the rate of our brain activity. So literally across our cortex, we have electrochemical signals washing across them. And when we're awake and alert, doing something fascinating, like participating in today's session, that rate can be 40 to 60 times a second as a baseline. And as we begin to move towards sleep and we pass through that meditative state that we have all felt maybe when we're studying, we're very interested in something, our brains have those brain waves moving at about 20 hertz or 20 times a second. When it gets down to about 10 to 12, that's we're on the edge of being awake to asleep. And most people have that sensation periodically of not really knowing, am I awake, am I asleep? And it's that zone. Slower brainwave rates put us into stages of sleep. Right now, there are 3 stages of what we would call regular sleep that we can really think of in terms of that brain activity slowing. And in the deepest sleep, sometimes called delta sleep, the rate can be as low as 1 hertz. So our brains still have some activity that spans the whole range of rates, but we're looking at the predominant activity. And then the brain will speed up after slowing to complete one of these cycles that we're talking about. And right when it looks like we might be headed to wake up, we enter the REM period, which is our eyes flashing back and forth. This is when we're dreaming, and our brain activity as measured by an EEG, looking at the voltages on our scalp, can look very similar to being awake. It's that fast, but yet we are asleep. We experience some involuntary paralysis of voluntary muscles, presumably to stop us from acting out these dreams. And then the cycle starts again for a healthy sleeper. And that first REM activity happens typically, about 100 minutes nominally after we first fall asleep. And the time we spend in the deepest sleep part of the cycle is larger at the beginning of the night than at the end, because our bodies are very hungry for that deep sleep and all the good things that happen. Our tissues are being repaired. Probably what seems to be the most beneficial thing is it's during deep sleep we now know that our brains activate some cleaning mechanisms where it cleans out a lot of the byproducts of cellular activity. We don't have a lymphatic system in our brains to clear that away. So our brains literally shrink, by some estimates, up to 20%, and that allows a perfusion of cerebral spinal fluid to go through our brains and wash out this stuff, which may include those beta amyloid plaques that are the hallmark of Alzheimer's. And we've got the first longitudinal studies that show a direct link between lack of deep sleep and a propensity to develop Alzheimer's. So it's very important that we get sleep. We've got to get away from this idea that it's a badge of honor to go out to go without sleep. I worked all night last night showing what a great person I am, when in fact we will pay a price down the road for this lack of attending to the benefits to our overall health for getting sleep. So we want to encourage these cycles, and we do know that when people go without sleep, it messes up that sleep cycle pattern completely. Alcohol messes with it, so we need to understand it and help people understand their sleep better so they can change their behaviors to get the maximum benefit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in terms of this engagement with sleeping, it's a science and it's a necessity, but I guess the engagement with it and the narrative and the stigma around certain types of sleeping or not sleeping, or the tendency for some people to overwork and to kind of eat into that's kind of obviously one of the big problems. Rachel, I'd ask you this question in relation to your work as an artist and the engagement of an audience, I suppose, with this idea of sleep. Can you just tell us a bit about how you engage with the topic, first of all, with your audience, and then kind of how you interplay with some of the science parts of what Michael was describing?
Yeah. So as an artist, I've always been really interested in bridging the gaps of understanding and the different communities, scientific communities and artistic communities, and finding a way to, I guess, go a bit beyond like public engagement. We've been, as a studio, creating platforms in public spaces which bring scientific researchers together so that they can really share their research and engage with the public directly. One of the projects that we did was called the Cronarium, and it started off in Singapore, I think in 2016, and it was like an installation that we built in quite a busy shopping mall, and we were really looking at how we could control the environment and different environmental stimuli in order to shift people's bodies into deeper states of relaxation. So we were looking at ways in which we could control the lighting and the sound, and really looking at different frequencies and the effect, physiological effect, but also just kind of this general state of well-being. So that's kind of how the project started, and it kind of has been growing and been shown in different communities. We then showed it in Manchester at the at the Science Festival. And again, it went right into the Arndale Shopping Centre, which is an extremely busy, there's a lot of huge amount of people passing by, and we sort of built this almost temple dedicated to sleep and sharing sleep facts over there. And yeah, we had a sort of a forum and a platform to share like tips and information about sleeping, but it really became like a discussion point and a platform where people could come, they could enter this space. And what was really interesting about the work that we were doing, which wasn't really thought about in such great detail, was this sense of togetherness. And obviously when we go to bed, we're generally, some of us are quite often alone in our bedrooms. It's quite an intimate, alone type of experience, and it was interesting to start doing these projects, which were where you would go into the space and there'd be like 20 other people all suspended in hammocks, being held by these textiles and being bathed in different frequencies of lights and sound, and really being looked after by some facilitators. Some sleep scientists were there, and just to kind of really look after people. And this sense of togetherness was something that became quite interesting, and the socialness of sleep, which doesn't normally kind of exist. So we worked with researchers who would then had different EEG headsets. We would have some participants who would answer some questions and actually end up dedicating and being part of actual sort of research projects. So it was interesting to engage with the scientific community in this way, where it became beyond public engagement, but where we were actually helping different scientific communities conduct their kind of research. And we were just looking at how we played and controlled and did things in the environment, what kind of effect this had in terms of shifting people, through the different brain states, from theta, alpha, beta, how we can shift these different states. And we've worked with various kind of biometric sensors to do this. We've been recently looking more at meditation, meditative states, and just different ways of observing and analysing this and getting kind of biofeedback. And we found, EEG headsets, it sounds great to be able to monitor your brain waves, and it has a very kind of nice kind of sci-fi thing. But in terms of useful data, it's quite difficult to really engage with. But we found just really looking at breath and heart rate, so using chest breath expansions and really looking at how people change their breath and how that affects their heart, and how we can look at states of relaxation. And I think looking at that actually became more interesting when we're sort of starting to talk about sleep and sleep science, really. How can we make people feel calm and to clear the mind, so that you're in a position to sleep? Because even just, for someone who suffers from insomnia, being told, you must sleep, I must sleep, I must sleep, I'm not sleeping, is just, you put yourself under a huge amount of personal pressure. And it's I'm a bad person, I can't sleep, oh my God, I need to go to bed, why am I not going to bed? So it's how do we prepare ourselves to sleep? And how can we have a conversation around it, a public conversation, which is kind of less guilt driven, you must sleep, it's so important. So I think,
It's a tough one, isn't it? The psychology and the physiology, they kind of interact. Lizzie, yeah. I'd love to ask you about broader technologies. Rachel and Michael have talked about EEG as a method of measuring brainwaves and how that relates very, very closely to sleep. You're the president of the European Society of Sleep Technologists, which sounds fantastic. I want to do that. That sounds awesome. Tell us about what's out there. What can you measure in terms of sleep signals, and what's the kind of input for sleep science and measurement of sleep, and what's out there at the moment that people may or may not have heard about?
Sure. So it's quite interesting that we're talking about EEG, because the sort of traditional EEG-based polysomnography is really, when we talk about sleep technology from a clinical perspective, that's generally what we're talking about. Sleep physiologists and sleep technologists tend to work mainly with the EEG-based PSG. But there are a lot of newer technologies out there, and of course the consumer wearable market has blossomed hugely in recent years, which obviously you'll know a lot more about than I do. But things like movement are very important. We can use things like activity as a a surrogate marker of sleep and wake. So when someone's moving, we assume they're awake. When they're not moving, we assume they're asleep. But then also, as Rachel mentioned, things like breathing, heart rate. There are devices out there now that use things like peripheral arterial tone, so changes in the blood pressure at the tip of the finger, as a way to measure proxy measures of sleep and sleep stages. I mean, I think what's exciting for me as a sleep technologist is how these novel sensors that are coming through from people like Michael, from engineers and data scientists, the sort of new side of things that's coming through could really revolutionize sleep medicine from a technological perspective. I guess things like artificial intelligence and machine learning are big areas at the moment which are being applied to sleep data. And I think that gives us a lot of exciting interdisciplinary opportunities to replace the traditional technologies with something quicker, easier, more reliable, easier to do in big volumes. To sit down and score an EEG-based sleep study can take anything up to 3-4 hours of manual labour to score that study. And if we can have big data, use big data sets to use AI to automate that process and take out the inter-scorer variability that there is there, anything that's based on humans interpreting physiological signals is subjective and fraught to sort of variation between scorers. So I think from my perspective, having something like AI applied to physiological data that can just take out that step for us and give us reliable automated scoring of sleep studies would be really, really important. And we've actually got our DPhil student working on this in Oxford at the moment, but I know there are lots of other people out there who are using deep learning and machine learning to automate the process. I guess some of the other exciting things that are out there at the moment, there's a new technology, a device called Sunrise, which uses mandibular movement, so movement of the jawbone, as a way to work out breathing and sleep stages. And then all of the wearables, anything that uses a sort of limited channel EEG, that's a sort of minimally invasive technique that people can use in the home. So there was a technology called the Zeo a number of years ago, which was really promising, and then kind of died a death. So I guess the sort of limited channel EEG coming through again would be really quite useful from a clinical perspective, but also could be really useful for consumers, because I think it's clear, the reason that we're all here is because consumers are really keen on monitoring their own health and their own well-being, and I think there's lots of opportunities where the new sleep signals and novel sensors to measure sleep could have an application there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I guess brainwaves, that's kind of the one, isn't it? That's what you want to measure. But as someone who's worked on these signals and the sensors around them, I'm struck by the starkness, I suppose, of the example of brain monitoring technologies, and just the void between what works scientifically and what consumers are willing to use. And it took me a while to find any kind of plausible consumer application in my sort of training, I guess, as a wearable tech person many years ago, until I came across sleep. And it was like, well, if the person's asleep and you've got reasonably good electrodes on them, you've got a fighting chance of taking their brainwaves and getting some useful information there. So for me, sleep and EEG, that's the perfect combination. But even that, you won't get away with using wet electrodes across the head, measuring all sorts of, it's kind of a dry electrode, badly placed through hair scenario, and that's the challenge that we face in a lot of the product development we do. It's around user experience, and I think having you, Rachel, on the panel to talk about that kind of engagement, that user side of things, I want to come back to that in a moment. I'm going to ask Michael first of all, though, about that from a sort of engineering and productization point of view. What have you had challenges in that space? Wet electrode science, consumers and consumer electronics?
Sure, a lot, and I appreciate the leading question because it is very challenging. And as you point out, not the least of which is even assuming we have something that would give quality data regarding brainwaves, it's getting people to use it. And I've had companies do professional marketing studies that included my product, which right now is a headband. And a lot of people are reluctant to put something on their heads. And it is a challenge to help them appreciate the benefit outweighs the time or perceived discomfort. And what we find is that, for a long time, people used to wear sleeping caps before central heating became ubiquitous, but they're reluctant now to wear something on their heads. And I will say that as an engineer, please know that I appreciate data, and data is very important. And it's very important, especially if we want to help people understand their health, as Lizzie says, and as Rachel made clear, sleep is about an experience, and understanding how to optimize that experience is dependent upon data. But for me, the part that I think we maybe as a community have been missing out on is the focus really is how do we help people sleep better? And it's a little frustrating when someone, say, is wearing an actigraph on one's wrist, and it tells them, you had a bad night's sleep. Well, the first reaction is, I know I had a bad night's sleep, and they put that thing in the drawer, and it stays in the drawer. And it turns out to not be a net positive for them when that's the end. And if we have this idea of we're coming at it from the perspective of first and foremost, what do we need to do actively to help them sleep? And then ask ourselves, how does the data feed into that as a goal, where too often I think we get this notion that big data is somehow the end point. And again, that might be good for big pharmaceutical companies who are looking for ways of decreasing costs of doing an analysis of a new pharmaceutical solution. It isn't helping that particular end user. And a drawback of using many of the surrogates for brain activity, and although brainwaves sounds a little scary for the typical user, and I'd much rather just wear a wristwatch than something that's touching my scalp, what I have found through my own testing, and without mentioning any companies' names, it is clear to me that the typical mode of presenting the consumer with data about sleep is to fit a curve that simulates that type of sleep I talked about at the beginning with these cycles, and we go in and out of deep and light sleep. And then companies are using the motion data to try to figure out where the peaks and valleys, and then they present that to a user. And whereas that might be good enough for maybe the majority of people, I can tell you for those that we would like to identify in the population who have something serious going on with their sleep that maybe they should need to see an expert about, these devices can cover that up. For example, someone with narcolepsy can immediately go into that REM period of sleep and not wait 100 minutes or so before experiencing that. And a lot of these devices will not pick up on the fact that a person is asleep but having a REM period of sleep at the beginning, because it doesn't fit the curve fit that is the foundation, again, of this presentation to consumers. And I do believe that because of this, and I think it's done with the best intentions of taking what many times is an inadequate data set because you're dealing with someone's bedroom, they haven't put this thing on right. So we're doing the best we can, but it can end up being a disservice, at least, of showing someone something that maybe isn't an accurate representation of their sleep, all the way to turning them off of the notion of sleep tech, because all it does is tell me that I slept bad when I know I slept bad, or even worse, I had a horrible night's sleep, but my wristwatch tells me I had a pretty good night's sleep. Who am I going to believe in that scenario? So it is a big challenge, and I think we, again, as a community, haven't done people a service by allowing them to think that somehow from a bedside unit we can tell you how your sleep is, and we actually have done nothing to assist you in sleeping better. And I do understand when Rachel says she's not sleeping well. Every day I get messages from people who tell me that their life, the quality of life is not good because they're not able to get enough sleep, and there is this pressure to perform. And there is some research showing that blue light will indeed help stimulate the brain into thinking that, oh, it's wake time, so you should stay away from those screens at night for that input. But I believe in most cases, looking at the cell phone as you're trying to sleep, it's what's written there that is far worse than the blue light. When you see that, yes, Jacob is going on vacation again, that guy is always going on vacation. I never get to go on vacation. How are you going to sleep after reading that? Because again, you're not allowing your brain to slow down because of all the worries and cares in modern society. And what we need to think about, I believe, with wearable tech is first and foremost, how do we calm people so they can allow their own brains to slow down and get that deep sleep?
That's a great segue, Rachel, into a question for you in relation to, I guess, the broader picture of a product or a kind of piece of tech in someone's life trying to assist them. And I guess with your work, you've kind of looked at the journey of sleep and the narrative of sleep and people's perception and the social engagement of sleep, potentially. Lots of different dimensions to it because it's such a personal thing. It's such a universal thing. How can we design technologies that are sensitive enough to engage with that quantity within people's lives?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question, and thank you, Michael, for what you were saying. I think it really resonates with me. Like, how do you allow people to calm their mind? I mean, I've done a huge amount of work myself, working with different lighting suppliers, lighting technologists, and dealing a lot with light and taking probably quite a scientific and almost engineered view to the environment. But I'm very much aware that. It's how you can use technology to help people get into a place where they can empty their mind, or they can record something, or they can really prepare themselves and move away from an environment or a way of thinking which is incredibly stressful and catastrophic. And how do you calm down? So how can we use technology in a mindful way and allow people to meditate, contemplate, calm down? So I'm really interested in that use of tech. And also thinking about, this doesn't answer this question enormously, but I'm just really interested in thinking about sleep, not just for like a specific group of people, but what does sleep mean for someone who's doing shift work? What does sleep mean for someone who's like, I don't know, in a state of like constant panic and they're traumatized? What does sleep mean if you're homeless, which actually really became an issue when we were doing this project in Manchester. The biggest community and people that would come and actually use the sleep lab were homeless people, and they were just like, "Thank God, there's a safe space. I can just sleep. I only ever get 15 minutes of sleep because that's the longest I could really sleep somewhere, and then I have to move on." So I found myself speaking to this group of people that I wouldn't normally be speaking to about sleep. And it just made me think about the topic very, very differently. So how do we design society, not just technology, that allows everybody to have better quality of sleep? And there's obviously this very strong link between mental health, mental well-being, and sleep quality, which obviously perpetuates people's situations if they're getting a poor sleep. So I found that quite challenging, being there talking about sleep to the privileged people rushing about shopping. And it made me think about how do we design technology, environments, society, even for everyone really, and looking at the sort of equality of sleep. But then also I've been doing sort of my own personal research and looking into ways in which I can use light and feedback from light. So I've been through the whole thing of collecting data, looking at the data, my data, other people's, and analysing it. But being an installation artist, I'm always really excited about live data, live feedback, immediate. You don't necessarily get that when you're sleeping, but you can get that before you sleep and when you're in this preparation environment where you're preparing for sleep. So I'm kind of really interested in kind of neurofeedbacks, biofeedbacks, which can help retrain you. So perhaps there's a way of wearing these EEG headsets or different biometric sensors, which actually retrain you, and you can go, okay, I'm doing this, I'm breathing in this particular way, I'm now shifting into this particular brain state, I'm shifting into this state, okay, now I can adapt my behaviors. So I'm really interested in how tech can be used to get immediate feedback so that you can kind of retrain and adapt and learn about what's going on in your body based on your immediate kind of experience, I guess, rather than analysing a night's data, and you don't really learn much from it.
It's interesting. You touched, or you're talking, I guess, about biofeedback and that idea of looping round many times rather than it being a kind of one shot. That's your status. Yeah. I guess. I'm fascinated with biofeedback across all sorts of products and projects that we've been involved with. I wonder, Lizzie, have you had any kind of engagement with those kind of technologies where you're not just looking at the science of sleep, but you're actually looking at cause and effect relationships? Can you affect people to improve their sleep, for example, with biofeedback? Have you been involved in anything like that?
Not particularly. What does interest me though, and both Rachel and Michael have touched on this, is about the subjective experience of sleep. And we tend to, coming from a scientific background, we tend to focus a lot on the objective measures, but actually sleep's a very person-centered process, and it's all about how you perceive your sleep. There's no use in me sitting in a sleep lab telling someone that they sleep well if their subjective experience is that they sleep poorly. And I think what's interesting is a lot of the consumer devices will give you feedback on the quality of your sleep or the quantity of your sleep, but as Michael alluded to, if it's telling you you've had a great sleep and you know that you haven't, then that's not helpful. The flip side of that is if you're getting feedback that your sleep, if the feedback that you're getting isn't accurate, then that in turn impacts on your subjective perception. And my colleague Dimitri Gavrilov in Oxford, he carried out a study using actigraphs where they were rigged to give sham feedback. So participants would get randomly assigned sham feedback that either told them, you slept for 80% of the night last night, that's great, or you slept for 80% of the night and that's bad. And that actually influenced the subjective experience of sleep for the user. So I think that type of feedback, what kind of interests me is the quality of the feedback and the accuracy of the feedback. I guess it comes back to our different backgrounds, but I always want to know that something's valid and accurate, and particularly if that can have a negative impact on our consumers or our patients or our clients. I guess the other thing is that we have this new concept now of orthosomnia, where patients become excessively preoccupied or obsessed with monitoring their sleep. And if you've got someone who's already sleeping poorly, it's quite easy for them to get into a cycle of obsessing about their sleep. And I'm sure, Rachel, you can, relate to this yourself. But someone who doesn't sleep well, they start to obsess about their sleep. And we have to be very careful with our devices, whether They're consumer devices, whether they're clinical devices. We need to make sure that the feedback that we're giving people is proportionate, that it's valid, that it's accurate. And I think we do need to be careful that we don't, actually make people sleep worse. In terms of the actual biofeedback, I've not really been involved so much in that side of things. We do have devices that are available commercially for clinical purposes, where we use things like vibration feedback to get patients with sleep apnea to turn from their back onto their side, for instance. But beyond that, I've not had a huge amount. It's really been more with it tends to be the clinician that's giving the feedback. And I think that's where our backgrounds are very different. I guess what we're looking at is consumer devices where the consumer is managing their own health rather than the clinician giving that feedback. But as I say, I think it's interesting to remember that the feedback that comes from these devices can actually affect people's subjective experience in a negative fashion. But I guess we could also harness that to try and improve their sleep. And I guess there's the whole ethics around giving placebo feedback and whether that improves people's sleep. But I guess that's the ethics of that's quite complex. So maybe not a discussion for today.
Maybe don't prescribe that one today. So I guess, Michael, do you have any experience with biofeedback and the interrelationship between sort of cause and effect? Or indeed, as I was listening to your answer, Lizzie, I was thinking also about stress and anxiety and how these things are quite often intertwined. Is there any way of deconvoluting stress and anxiety and comparing it with sleep? And, if you're measuring people's brainwaves, broaden it out from just the sleep factor.
Well, as far as biofeedback goes, the approach I've taken with this Sleep Shepherd headband, which it's gratifying to have lots of positive feedback from people who have used it. So when you do help someone sleep better, that is a good feeling that you get. And I will just say, Rachel, I think it's wonderful that you took time to talk to people who are homeless, because I can only imagine the extra difficulties that they have. And I love the idea of our caring about them. But with biofeedback, I do measure a simple single-channel EEG. And when you're only measuring with at one place on the scalp, you do miss out on some of the wave-like behavior. So it is more difficult to get out what are just little anomalies in the signal. But for determining whether someone is awake or asleep, a single channel seems to be acceptable as long as you are getting an accurate signal, which I will also say can be problematic, again, when you're dealing with the realities of someone's bedroom and relying on them to put something on properly without help is a challenge in and of itself. Sometimes I have discovered that people were not satisfied with my product, and it came to find out they were wearing it backwards on their head, which to me is just, how can this be? There were pictures, but it's a reality that we have to face if we really want to help someone in that consumer space. We don't have the benefit of everything being in a sleep lab or on a benchtop in a laboratory, really helping people. But taking these measurements, I then play through thin speakers some very interesting binaural tones. And if you want to talk about those, I can all day, because they have a very interesting effect on the brainstem in kind of hypnotically fooling the brain into thinking that it is exposed to a periodic input when in fact none is actually being presented. And then we rely on brain entrainment, getting the rest of the brain to kind of follow in step with an external stimulus to encourage brain activity to slow down. And then using this sensor, I customize those tones in real time to try to maximize their benefit. And when someone is in deep sleep, the tones will fade away, ready to come on again. So there's that little biofeedback loop in the operation. But I also have come to appreciate anecdotally, and I haven't been able to do a study specifically about this, but users tell me that their sleep gets improved and they don't have to wear this thing every night. And as an example, my attorney, when I first started trying to commercialize this product, he was going through a very difficult time in his life. And he started wearing a sleep shepherd and was actually, like many people, shocked at how much help it gave him in sleeping. And now he tells me that he doesn't wear it normally, but he finds it helpful to use, say, right before he has to be in court the next day, or he's got a big meeting and he wants to make sure that he's sleeping well. So I hope that means that there is this brain learning through biofeedback, and the brain actually is teaching itself how to slow its activity when it is sleepy time. So that is a biofeedback loop that I hope is active, and there is some research to support that idea.
Yeah, you've definitely got to the nub of it. I didn't realize quite how integrated your platform was in terms of that biofeedback loop, but that's definitely kind of a really great example. And we've done work with binaurals as well, so I know very much about that mechanism. It's fascinating and a great brain interface, that kind of technology. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to wind things up. I'm going to ask a question, and if you could just give me a kind of quick one-line response, each of you, if you have a thought on this. What can people do in terms of using technology to enable sleep right now? Is there something kind of obvious that they should be doing if they're struggling to sleep? Is there a product or a service? And maybe this is maybe you go somewhere else, Michael, than the Sleep Shepherd, which is an obvious candidate. But just a quick one-liner on that, if you have something to say. Let's start with Lizzie.
Put on the spot, I would say thinking about technology that's already out there and already in use. There's an app called Sleepio, which delivers digital online cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. It's been validated, it's in use in the NHS, and it's a great example of how we can sort of move the therapist out of the hospital or out of the office and into someone's pocket. So that would be my quick one line off the top of my head.
Fantastic, great answer. Rachel.
Yeah, there's loads of amazing sleep apps out there and ones that I use. And I mean, for me, I like to use kind of lighting. I use the Philips Hue lighting, and I set it and I program it in the bedroom to fade through the Kelvin scale, to fade into a sunset so it gets dark. And I also couple that with using binaural and using sound within the space. I listen a lot to the work of Leo Kasendai, who's a sound meditator who helps with sleep. So I listen to his stuff before bed in a sort of darkened environment, and I find that really helps.
Fantastic, thank you. Brilliant answer. And Michael?
Well, I would just say kind of where we began. If we as individuals as society, culture, just take a different view of sleep and don't perceive it as being the thing that is expendable whenever we need a little extra time to get something done. There is no badge of honor in missing out on sleep.
Yeah, I think those are great insights from the team. And thank you so much for joining this discussion today. We're going to move to questions now from the audience, and we've got 10 or 15 minutes to look at some of the questions that are coming through. So just let me say thank you again to the panel for today's session, and we'll open the floor up now to questions.
I think we're just issues. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Well, another great panel discussion today around sleep, and we're all gathered here to kind of now take some questions from the floor, hopefully. At the moment, we have few questions, and I'd love for the people on the channel to start putting some stuff into the chat window rather than the questions tab. Counterintuitively, it's the chat window that we'd like you to stick your questions. So, yeah, please have a think about the discussion today and pitch some ideas in for some questions. I've got like a whole page of questions that I've written, and I don't really want to ask them all because I've asked tons of questions already. But I will start with one, and I'm going to pick one at random, sort of. We talked in another show that we did, or another session we did, around pharmaceuticals, and we're a health show. There's still a lot of pharma in the world. People still use drugs to achieve things with their health, and that's all well and good. But there are ways of doing things without drugs now, and we were talking about mental health and about how one can use methods to improve mental health. But in terms of sleep and pharmaceutical interventions, are there any ways that we can use technology instead of pharmaceuticals for the purposes of improving our sleep?
Shall I take that one?
Why not? You kick us off, Lizzie. Thank you.
Yeah, so the one that jumps to mind immediately is the Sleepio app, or there are a number of different apps. I shouldn't really single out one, but certainly Sleepio is one. There's another one called Sleep Station, and these are digital online cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. So that's a way that interactive technology is already being used in place of pharmaceuticals. So the NICE guidelines recommend CBT for insomnia as the first line treatment for insomnia over and above medication. So that's a way that technology is sort of sidestepping medication in some ways. And that's already out there and validated and being recommended. It's not always necessarily available free to everyone. I know that there are parts of England at the moment where Sleepio and Sleep Station are available for free, and Sleepio is available to all health and social care professionals for free at the moment because of the current situation, as a way to improve the sleep of healthcare workers. But it can be a bit patchy in terms of availability, but it is out there. Either free or at a cost, and that's a way that it's already being implemented. But I think that as we go forward, there's going to be far more new technologies that will come through that will start to do similar sort of techniques. And I know that there's already some out there, for instance, looking at anxiety disorder and depression. And I think this is something that, anything where face-to-face therapy might be an option can be in some ways automated or replaced by digital technologies.
Yeah, and following up with that, and I agree with that. Part of the issue around cognitive behavioral therapy of all kinds, though, is getting people to follow through. Most of us know, stay away from refined sugars, and the list goes on of how we should live and floss twice a day, brush 3 times a day. And just knowing that these things are good for us are difficult. Part of the appeal, of course, for pharma solutions is it's popping a pill and I'm done, right? It's going to happen without my participation after I swallow. So in the kind of form of what I would call more pure technology would be ways of trying to stimulate the brain through, right now, the 5 senses. It remains to be seen whether or not the various attempts to sink electrodes into people's brains in order to stimulate directly inside the skull. We'll see. But right now, using the senses to affect body changes, physiological changes, is interesting. And we can look at some of the changes that naturally occur when we sleep. And we talked about in the session brain waves slow. So if we can think about ways of affecting that, core body temperature goes down. So if we could affect that change, maybe there would be a feedback to encourage sleep. There, of course, is the visual inputs. And people have tried a variety of these things, even including transcranial electrical stimulation, in hopes of getting a frequency of electrical impulses that would encourage the brain to adopt that. I caution people to try that, especially that is one of those don't try this at home kinds of solutions, I think. But as we learn more about how the body responds to sleep, I think we will get better and better about using technology to try to affect those changes by working naturally with body systems. But I still think we're at the front end of that.
Rachel, I know you've got some video problems, but you're on the call, and thanks for joining us. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of topic around, removing the drugs from the sort of poor sleeping equation?
Yeah,
you must have experienced lots of stuff in that space.
I've personally looked at lots of different options. Apologies for the no video, by the way. But I'm really interested in ways that we can meditate and have more understanding of what's happening within our inner world and our brain. I've also been doing a lot of work into looking at how sound and light can be really considered as medicine, really. And how we can basically use sound and binaural beats to shift our brain states, which is obviously sort of a fairly old concept, really, in terms of using tech, but really looking at ways that we can bring this into the bedroom and bring it into sort of everybody's home, really, so that we can reprogram our brains. It was actually one of the only things that helped me when I had periods of insomnia, was listening to binaural beats and sound, and using sound in that way. So yeah.
I've got a question that follows on from that, because we're still waiting for some of the audience to push their questions forward. So please, everyone out there, give us some questions. There's a fantastic panel here, and they'd love to hear what you've got to say, and we can answer those questions live to the audience across the globe. I'm going to ask about prescribing technology, leading on from the pharma discussion. Can we go to our doctor, Michael, and get a sleep shepherd on prescription?
Well, currently, of course, things that, at least in the US, where I'm more familiar with regulatory approvals, once something is regulated, then it almost restricts its use, because using things off-label, people get a little worried about that. Lawsuits can ensue. And for me, in the wellness regime, I think if we really believe that wellness is about a lifestyle that keeps us from getting sick and maybe having to get prescriptions, that we would like the technology to fit more into that and be less regulated, so people have better access, certainly lower cost access. Clearly, if we're dealing with a tech solution that has the possibility of doing harm if used incorrectly, we need to think long and hard about how we control that, of course. But most of the technologies that I see coming online that are meant to encourage healthier lifestyles, I think can sit for the most part in the consumer category. And the ones that help will flourish, and the ones that don't really help will get pushed to the side, we hope. But I think if we can keep it out of the hands of the regulators to the extent that's reasonable, it's a good goal.
Do the panel have any other thoughts on the prescription of technology? We're in the UK, Rachel and Lizzie, and I guess we have slightly different regulations, but similar kind of challenges, I guess. Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, there are some aspects where technology is already being prescribed. So the one that springs to mind is light therapy. So patients who have circadian rhythm disorders can, in some parts of the country, certainly in Edinburgh, where I worked previously, and many other sleep centres around the country, you can be prescribed light therapy, you can be given a light box to take home, but obviously that's quite large, quite cumbersome. There are cost implications around supplying these devices to huge numbers of people, and I think we need to find smarter ways to deliver that kind of technology. Certainly with the current situation, the days of just popping into a sleep centre and picking up a piece of equipment to take home, which you then bring back and is reused, with problems that we have with COVID at the moment, that's just not feasible. And I think finding ways to miniaturize technology and, wearable devices in particular would be a way around this. And I think part of what Michael's alluded to as well is, we want to look at prevention rather than treatment. So looking at the preventative aspects that would stop people from having to come and receive the therapy from a specialist tertiary centre, for instance, or even from a primary care provider. I think looking at the preventative aspect of consumer monitoring and wearables and how that can reduce the need to visit a specialist, I think that's one of the areas that we should be concentrating on.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm going to pick up on a term that was used in the discussion. I think it was you, Rachel, who raised seasonal adjustment disorder. And it got me thinking about that and vitamin D and sleep and the interplay between those things. I don't know the answer, or I don't even know the question to some degree, but can the panel sort of talk about those things and the interplay potentially between those?
Is anyone else? I can take this one if no one else is jumping in. So the vitamin D side of things, not so much, but certainly the changes in light across the seasons. We know a lot now about the receptors in the eye, which control the switching on and off of melatonin, which is the sleepiness hormone. And certainly part of the story is that over the course of the year, the amount of light and dark that we have on a daily basis changes. And if you were to take away all the external cues that we have on a daily basis that pin us down to a 24-hour rhythm, then light is the most potent one of these cues that pins down our circadian rhythm. So as the seasons change throughout the year, then in theory, if we were following the natural seasonality, then our bedtime and rise time would change. So if you put people in environments where they're completely governed by light, so for instance, there's a project in Norway where they have a glass house that you can go and live in, and that 24-hour, or rather the light and dark cycle will determine your sleep and wake cycle. So I'm not so sure about the vitamin D side of things. Obviously vitamin D is very important and is produced when we're exposed to sunlight. But in terms of sleep, it's more the effect of the light entering the eye, switching off the melatonin to tell you that it's morning, or the sun going down at sunset and switching your melatonin on, that tends to be more of the driver. And seasonal affective disorder is not my specialist area at all, but there are obviously very clear links, bidirectional links, between sleep and mood and sleep and depression. And it makes sense that as the amount of light and dark changes, and you're perhaps working against your natural cycle. So, the light outside is telling you should be going to bed, but the light inside your house is telling you should be awake. It makes sense that there would be an impact. Like I say, seasonal affective disorder is not my area, but certainly there are clear links between sleep and mental health and light. So, I don't know if I've answered the question there, but maybe some of the other panelists have something to add.
I mean, I've done a lot of work around light and light therapy as an artist, but I remember when I was researching it, what became really clear is that light therapy in relation to controlling the circadian rhythm was really important for people who are traveling, so people suffering from jet lag, and people doing shift work. So it's just interesting how we now have to use artificial lighting to deal with a certain artificial way of living, where we can fly across the globe at such a speed and expect to work through the night when usually we wouldn't. So we're sort of going against some of our biological instincts and then remedying it with technology. So I guess it's important to look at those natural cycles and maybe look at this glass house sort of scenario. But yeah, I think there's a huge amount of health problems, mental health issues around people working and doing night shifts when they're sort of working under sort of extremely bright fluorescent daylight tubes, and this has like a really great impact on the sort of physiology and mental health. So yeah.
I've actually this past summer I spent the summer waking up with the sun. So rather than the sort of the notion of having blackout blinds and kind of metronomically sleeping. I went for the kind of like keep the windows open, and I found it fantastic actually, and I felt my sleep was much better for doing that, which probably links to what you're describing in terms of the melatonin and the cycle. And I guess over time people have become accustomed to 8 hours rather than swaying between 7.5 and 8.5 maybe, or something, as the seasons adjust. Really interesting topic. Michael, I'm going to jump back to a comment you made about Alzheimer's and about this idea that the brain shrinks and gets cleaned up by sleep. It's quite fascinating, but scary at the same time, that we can be potentially giving ourselves long-term problems without going through that cycle. Is it possible to kind of really link those things together, Alzheimer's and lack of sleep? Is that something that's in the literature and a thing, or what is the link between those sort of categorically?
Yeah, it is a thing that there is a link between missing out on deep sleep in particular and the propensity to show signs of dementia later in life. The exact mechanism is still being investigated about what causes the link, but there is a clear one. In fact, sleep is typically, I've seen listed as the second most important indicator for Alzheimer's next to genetics. So there is something there. And the general thinking now is, as we talked about, the buildup of these beta amyloid, the twisted proteins that result from normal activity aren't being cleared away as they should be, because the mechanisms that the body uses to do that are initiated when we are in deep sleep. So the thinking goes, and it certainly seems rational, that if you miss out on deep sleep, then you're not activating those mechanisms, and therefore that would result in this buildup that we see of the plaques. And it's only recently that we have some imaging techniques that allow us to see these beta amyloids. We've got some now markers that will adhere to those. And what's been noticed is, again, we used to think that Alzheimer's, other dementias were something that plagued older people, but not people under 65, say. But we now see that these plaques are building up over time. And then some other mechanism that some people are beginning to work out kind of activates it by running around and clipping the tails off of all of these beta amyloid proteins that cause them to wrap around and destroy neurons. That is then a progressive situation, and we see a decline in mental acuity and the other things. So getting sleep is very important now for our health later in life, for sure.
Yeah, we've done a bit of, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, if I could go back to something Rachel was talking about with shift workers, there is a company that is a global manufacturer, and shocker, they discovered that the workers who are working the night shift have much more errors on the manufacturing line than do the workers in the daytime. And of course, the solution they want is what any good capitalist enterprise would want, and that is to fix those nighttime employees so they can perform better at night. And they did a study with almost 100 people using my product. And since I had access, there was someone doing the study independently, but I had access to the data. And the thing that was most shocking to me is it isn't just we're asking these nighttime workers to change their schedule to somehow sleep in the day and not at night. But what we're doing is we're putting them in a horrible situation, because when I actually got to look at the sleeping patterns of people who are on the job from midnight until 8 a.m., it is just horrifying how they are sleeping for 2 hours and then another 45 minutes and then 3 hours scattered through the day. And that kind of fragmentation does not allow, again, the brain to do its natural cycles that we look to for good health. So I think that is something that we do need to address as a society and do something better for workers put in this situation.
Lizzie, were you going to jump in on the previous point?
I was, yes. I was just going to comment on the glymphatic clearance of the brain that Michael was talking about. So a lot of that work was done in animal models, but there have been a few studies now which do seem to show that this glymphatic system, as it's known, that's upregulated during slow wave sleep is active in humans as well. And some of the work that we have ongoing in Edinburgh, in conjunction with a team in Toronto, we've been looking at the sort of vascular aspects of that. So looking at the very small spaces around the blood vessels in people who have obstructive sleep apnea. So people who have very broken sleep and drops in oxygen levels. And what we've been doing is some MRI imaging of the small vessels around the brain, around the small spaces around the blood vessels in the brain in people with sleep apnea before and after treatment. So we don't have the results as yet because the study's still ongoing, but certainly it looks like there is some impairment of the clearance of the fluid because of these enlarged perivascular spaces. So it's a kind of watch this space, but I think there's a growing body of evidence now that poor sleep and sleep disorders do seem to be implicated in both Alzheimer's type dementia, but also in vascular dementia. So we see a lot of cardiovascular problems in people who sleep poorly, and certainly on the small vessel disease, stroke side of things, we're starting to get a lot more information there. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a growing problem, and we are starting to gather the evidence. I think we've always kind of assumed that because there are cognitive effects when you don't sleep well, that it would follow on, that there would be links with dementia. But I think we're now starting to get some really solid evidence. So it's not out there to scare people, but just to start to highlight the importance of sleep, not just for your physical health, but for your brain health and for your mental health as well.
Thank you. That's really informative. And the linking of sleep and cardiology happened within that description. I'm really kind of fascinated to go away and have a look at that. We do a fair bit of work on cardio signals. I'm gonna wrap things up because we've talked. I've got still more questions, but I'm going to just ask one more, and it's this one. The session today has been called "Learning to Sleep in a World Turned Up to 11," which is obviously a bit of a clickbait sort of title, and we thought it would bring in some really interested people, and the conversation has been fantastic and interesting. But I'm gonna get that question answered. How do we learn to sleep? What are the approaches that we should be taking to improve sleep? On a basic level, let's not cover the don't drink at 12 o'clock 3 pints. Let's avoid that. But what can we do to improve our sleep? And are there any technologies that we should be using to do that potentially?
Well, I'll kick off with this one as well. I think going back to Rachel's points around light and the manipulation of light, I think it's almost about going back to basics, about using technology to enhance our inbuilt physiological mechanisms. So rather than trying to work against our bodies to get us to, be in a state that is incongruent with where our body wants to be, I think using the environment and using the inbuilt capabilities that we have, sort of using technology to enhance our own body's brilliant ability to sleep rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. Rachel kind of talked about us working against our bodies and then using technology to try and get back to where we were to start with. Maybe it's about, taking what we've already got and using the technology to enhance that even more. Just, I don't know how we go about doing that. I guess that's the job of people like yourselves, but that would certainly be my thought.
Yeah, I really agree with you there. Looking at the body's natural rhythms, understanding our bodies more, looking at, I guess, having a broader definition of what technology is also. For me, it's understanding quietness, meditation, perhaps looking at ideas around social technology, making sure that there's connection, like loneliness, anxiety is one of the biggest causes of not being able to sleep. So having maybe technology which helps remedy our digital hygiene, clearing from the bedroom, that kind of thing. I know it's not really what people want to hear, but yeah, being in a situation where we're not overly stressed, overly anxious, and looking at the kind of the role that technology plays in our lives on a daily basis through work, because it's all completely shifted at the moment for everyone, hasn't it, in terms of COVID and the lockdown, and we're all working from homes and working from bedrooms, and what kind of digital hygiene should be implemented in order to allow for relaxation and sleep to happen.
I agree with both of those. And for me, though, I think we are faced with the problem that we tend to enter all of these fields with very idealistic and noble goals. The computer age was supposed to usher in a time of leisure to free people up to pursue those higher level pursuits. But yet we have this tendency to turn everything into a game of efficiency. We always have to be ever more efficient, ever more getting more done. And sleep is kind of the odd one out when we think about living a good life. Everyone can agree nutrition is important to keep our bodies running well. You got to put the right fuel in. And exercise is important as well for maintaining fitness. And both of those things are interesting in that you get instant feedback. When you're eating, it's a visceral experience. When you're exercising, you feel your muscles moving, and even though it might hurt, you feel good about the activity you're doing. And sleep is different in that you're getting no feedback, no conscious feedback while it's happening. And the benefits come actually when you're awake, the antithesis of sleeping. So you feel better when you're awake instead of kind of getting the reinforcement that this is a good activity. So I get back to our natural tendency is as technology comes online, and we do that with the hope of improving sleep to improving people's life. I think so often the way it is desired is rather, how can I use the technology so I don't have to sleep as much, so I can accomplish more, get more done in life, and be more successful, more productive, more even useful. So we need to battle against that whole idea that somehow sleep isn't as valuable, and the natural tendency, I think, is clear because we don't get that feedback while it's going on.
Fantastic answers, and really appreciate you joining us today live for this this conclusion to our track. And great to speak to you again today. I wish you all the best of night's sleep, and do take care. And thank you everyone who's joined us on the track. If you want to connect with the panel, remember you can connect to them via the Giant Health platform or at thrivewearables.com/giant2020. So thank you everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.